Forgotten battles of World War II. You've heard of D-Day, Stalingrad, and the Battle of the Bulge. But what if I told you there were battles just as intense, just as brutal, and just as important, yet barely anyone talks about them? Imagine a frozen wasteland where 11,000 Finnish soldiers take on over 30,000 Soviets and win. Picture an entire Allied fleet wiped out in a single naval battle, clearing the way for Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia. Or a castle in Austria where American soldiers and German defectors fought side by side against the SS. World War II was fought across nearly every continent in places most people have never even heard of. While the world remembers the grand campaigns that shaped history, many key battles remain overlooked. Today, we're diving into 10 of these forgotten battles, fierce, desperate, and crucial fights that helped decide the fate of the war. 1. The Battle of Kohima and Imphal, 1944. The Stalingrad of the East. Deep in the jungles of British India, two crucial battles raged between March and June 1944. Japanese forces, aiming to break British control in India and rally Indian nationalists to their cause, launched an ambitious invasion through Burma. Their goal was to capture the twin cities of Kohima and Imphal, cutting off Allied forces and securing a path into India. At first, the Japanese advanced with confidence, surrounding Kohima and besieging Imphal. Outnumbered and cut off, British and Indian troops dug in, facing relentless attacks, artillery barrages, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. The battle at Kohima saw some of the most intense fighting of the war, with soldiers locked in combat across the grounds of a British tennis court, turning it into a battlefield littered with the dead. Despite being outnumbered, the defenders held their ground. British air support kept supplies flowing, while relentless counterattacks pushed the Japanese back. After months of brutal fighting, the tide turned. Starving and weakened, the Japanese forces were forced to retreat. It was one of their worst defeats of the war, with over 50,000 casualties. The battle not only halted Japan's advance into India, but also shattered the myth of their invincibility in jungle warfare. 2. The Siege of Budapest, 1944 to 1945, Hungary's forgotten Stalingrad. While the world's attention was focused on the brutal battles of the Eastern Front, another deadly siege unfolded in the heart of Europe. The Siege of Budapest, lasting from December 1944 to February 1945, was one of the bloodiest urban battles of World War II. As Soviet forces advanced westward, Hitler ordered Budapest to be held at all costs. The city, defended by Hungarian and German troops, soon became a battlefield. Soviet forces encircled Budapest, cutting off all escape routes. Trapped civilians, along with tens of thousands of Axis soldiers, endured weeks of starvation, shelling, and street-to-street combat. Bridges were blown up, entire districts were reduced to rubble, and brutal winter conditions made survival even more difficult. Nazi commanders refused to surrender, even as supplies dwindled and casualties mounted. It wasn't until February 1945 that Soviet troops finally overran the city. By then, Budapest was in ruins, with over 100,000 dead, most of them civilians. The fall of Budapest marked a turning point in the Eastern Front, clearing the way for the Soviet push into Austria. Yet despite its significance, this battle remains overshadowed by larger sieges like Stalingrad and Leningrad. 3. The Battle of Monte Cassino, 1944. The bloody path to Rome. In early 1944, the Allies were struggling to break through German defensive lines in Italy. Their advance north was blocked by the formidable Gustav Line, a network of bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions stretching across mountains and rivers. At the heart of this line stood Monte Cassino, a historic monastery perched on a hilltop, overlooking the main road to Rome. Believing that the Germans were using the monastery as a defensive position, the Allies made a fateful decision. They bombed Monte Cassino into rubble. However, instead of weakening German defenses, the destruction of the monastery gave them even better cover. What followed was one of the most grueling battles of the war. For months, Allied troops, including American, British, Polish, and French forces, launched repeated assaults up the steep slopes of Monte Cassino. The Germans dug into bunkers and fortified caves, rained down artillery and machine gun fire. Every inch of ground was fought over, with soldiers crawling through mud, dodging sniper fire, and enduring endless barrages. It wasn't until May 1944, after 4 major assaults and tens of thousands of casualties, that the Allies finally broke through. Polish troops raised their flag over the ruins of the monastery, marking the hard-fought victory. The road to Rome was now open, but at a tremendous cost. The Battle of the River Plate, 1939. World War II's first naval showdown. Just weeks after the outbreak of World War II, the Atlantic became a hunting ground for the German Navy. One of the most feared raiders was the Admiral Graf Spee, a heavily armed German pocket battleship that prowled the South Atlantic, sinking Allied merchant ships. But in December 1939, the Royal Navy set a trap. A small British squadron consisting of 3 smaller cruisers, the HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles, intercepted the Graf Spee off the coast of Uruguay. Though heavily outgunned, the British ships launched a bold attack, dodging the Graf Spee's devastating 11-inch guns while firing back with everything they had. After an intense naval duel, the British damaged the German ship enough to force it into Montevideo Harbor for repairs. Under pressure from British intelligence operations and fearing he was surrounded, the Graf Spee's captain made a shocking decision. He scuttled the ship rather than face capture. The first major naval battle of the war had ended, and the Royal Navy had scored an early psychological victory, proving that the German surface fleet was not invincible. 5. The Battle of Manila, 1945. The forgotten urban nightmare. While the world focused on battles in Europe, one of the most horrific urban fights of the war erupted in the Philippines. When U.S. forces landed to liberate Manila in early 1945, they expected the Japanese to retreat. Instead, the city became a killing ground. Japanese forces, knowing they couldn't win, turned to a strategy of total destruction. They fortified buildings, booby-trapped streets, and massacred tens of thousands of civilians. As American and Filipino troops fought block by block, the city burned. Artillery fire reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, while brutal hand-to-hand combat raged in government buildings, cathedrals, and hospitals. By the time the battle ended, Manila was in ruins. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, making it one of the deadliest urban battles of the entire war. Yet despite its scale and brutality, the Battle of Manila remains one of the war's most overlooked tragedies. 6. The Battle of Suomussalmi, 1939 to 1940. The Finnish David vs. Soviet Goliath. In the freezing winter of 1939, a small Finnish force of just 11,000 soldiers faced a Soviet invasion force of over 30,000. The Soviets, expecting an easy victory, pushed deep into Finland, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. Using their knowledge of the terrain and brutal winter conditions, the Finns launched a brilliant guerrilla campaign. Moving on skis, they struck quickly, cutting off Soviet supply lines and isolating enemy units. Finnish snipers, hidden in the snowy forests, picked off Soviet soldiers one by one, while small Finnish squads destroyed entire Soviet convoys using hit-and-run tactics. The battle ended in a stunning Finnish victory. The Soviets lost over 20,000 troops, compared to just a few thousand Finnish casualties. Suomussalmi became a symbol of Finland's fierce resistance during the Winter War, proving that superior strategy could overcome overwhelming numbers. 7. The Battle of Tarawa, 1943. The bloodiest 76 hours. The U.S. Marine Corps' first major amphibious assault of the Pacific War turned into a brutal bloodbath. Tarawa, a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands, was heavily fortified by Japanese troops who had spent months preparing defenses. When the U.S. landed in November 1943, they walked into a nightmare. Shallow reefs forced American landing craft to unload troops far from shore, leaving them vulnerable to machine gun fire. Many drowned, others were cut down in the surf. Those who made it to the beaches faced bunkers, barbed wire, and fanatical Japanese resistance. Over 3 days of relentless fighting, U.S. forces pushed forward using flamethrowers, grenades, and sheer determination to clear enemy positions. When the battle finally ended, nearly 6,000 men, both American and Japanese, lay dead on an island just 2 miles long. Tarawa proved that the road to Tokyo would be paved with blood. 8. The Battle of Brody, 1941. The largest tank battle you've never heard of. When people think of massive tank battles in World War II, Kursk often comes to mind. But in June 1941, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, an even bigger tank clash erupted near the town of Brody in western Ukraine. The Soviets, desperate to halt the German advance, threw over 3,000 tanks into battle against a much smaller German force. On paper, the Red Army had the advantage, but chaos, poor coordination, and German air superiority turned the battle into a disaster. Soviet tank units, lacking fuel and proper communication, were picked apart by German panzers and aircraft. While individual Soviet crews fought bravely, their tanks were outmaneuvered and destroyed en masse. By the end of the battle, nearly 2,500 Soviet tanks had been lost, making Brody one of the biggest but least known tank battles of the war. 9. The Battle of Narva, 1944, the Waffen-SS last stand in the east. As the Red Army pushed westward in early 1944, they reached the Estonian city of Narva, where a small but determined force of German and Estonian troops made their stand. The defenders included soldiers from the Waffen-SS, but also Estonian conscripts who were fighting not for Nazi Germany, but to prevent a Soviet reoccupation of their homeland. Outnumbered nearly 10-1, the defenders of Narva used every defensive trick in the book. They turned the city's riverbanks and forests into a deadly maze of traps, bunkers, and artillery nests. Soviet troops launched wave after wave of attacks only to be cut down by machine gun fire and artillery barrages. For months, the battle raged on, with Narva becoming a symbol of desperation for both sides. Despite their numerical superiority, the Soviets failed to break through until late 1944, when a final massive offensive forced the Germans and their allies to withdraw. The battle delayed the Soviet advance into the Baltic for months, giving tens of thousands of civilians time to flee westward. Though overshadowed by larger Eastern Front battles, Narva remains one of the fiercest defensive struggles of the war. 10. The Battle of the Java Sea, 1942. The death of the Allied fleet. As Japan expanded across the Pacific in early 1942, one of the last major Allied naval forces in the region made a desperate stand. The Allied fleet, consisting of Dutch, British, American, and Australian warships, was tasked with stopping the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies. But they never stood a chance. Facing a superior Japanese fleet with better tactics, training, and equipment, the Allied ships sailed into disaster. On February 27, 1942, the two sides clashed in the Java Sea. The battle was chaotic, with torpedoes streaking through the water, shells raining down, and warships desperately maneuvering to avoid destruction. One by one, the Allied ships were sunk, their crews either killed or left to drown in the open ocean. By the end of the night, the Japanese had completely destroyed the Allied fleet. Over 2,300 Allied sailors died, and with their navies shattered, the Dutch East Indies fell to Japan shortly after. The battle was a grim reminder that, in the early days of the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy was nearly unstoppable. History is full of stories that deserve to be remembered, and these forgotten battles played a crucial role in shaping World War II. From the frozen forests of Finland to the last stand in Budapest, each of these conflicts had its own heroes, tragedies, and lessons that still matter today. Which battle surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and of course, subscribe for more untold stories from the past. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring history.